Well, it's been a while since I've been here, hasn't it? Oops. Sorry about that. Christmas and everything took precedent, and the whole sheeple crowd control meant YouTube came first and my priority was my main channel. But something did happen, something big enough, something that got my attention because this was supposed to have been done 2 weeks ago. I had planned a video for then, only to find out that Boris Johnson had blinked. He had made a concession, and I thought, great, another reason to not vote for Boris in 2024. Like he needs another one with how poorly he's handled sheeple crowd control. So why are we here now? Well, it turns out, at the 11th hour, after much blinking and many concessions, and with a 500-page book, so it's shorter than the Order of the Phoenix and has a far significantly lesser payoff, we have a deal. And this is not a joke. There is in fact a Brexit deal. Now I'd like to give a disclaimer before we go into the more interesting aspects. I still support no deal. The reason why is because I believe the UK government has given up too much ground on some very important and key issues. So how we're going to proceed is going to be on the individual issue and then who won it. For example, trade. Within this 500-page document, it is zero tariff, zero quota, which is the first in EU trade history. The reason why is any other country outside of the EU has to pay a 10% tariff. Now this covers trade worth more than £600 billion a year. There will, however, be some red tape, but that's the next issue. Because we don't pay a tariff, this is regarded as a win for the United Kingdom. This deal has been likened to that of Canada's deal, or a deal more commonly known as Canada Plus Plus, which I don't think anyone else has realised means Canada negative. So the next key issue would be customs and red tape. Without paying tariffs, something has to take its place, though, to ensure the correct goods are going to the right location. So there will be additional customs checks at borders. So it won't be seamless. No one expected it to be so, although there will be some arguments about Northern Ireland and Ireland. So there will be extra cooperation on roll-on, roll-off ports at places like Dover. There will need to be specific agreements for wine, pharmaceuticals, cars, and chemicals. This is regarded as a narrow win for the EU. So next we go for the automotive industry. UK car firms will be able to source 60% of their parts from outside the UK and the EU and still export them to Europe, with that level being reduced in subsequent years to allow for companies to adapt. This is a win for the UK as the EU wanted no transition period on this issue. On subsidies and state aid, it's regarded a draw, as both sides have to be transparent about subsidies they give businesses to ensure firms don't get an unfair advantage, with the EU and UK having to set up an independent authority to oversee state aid. There is no set limit for how much state aid qualifies as a problem, and disputes have to be settled on a case-by-case basis. UK isn't bound to EU state aid rules, which is great. But because of this agreement, we don't have our freedom, which I find to be quite concerning. In fact, this is the first big issue I take. On financial services, as we are moving from state aid, free movement of services will end, which means British firms have to comply with varying rules across member states instead of one set of rules. There is no decision on equivalence, which then allow financial firms such as banks to sell their services into the EU single market from the City of London. There is also no joint declaration that supports enhanced cooperation on financial oversight, which has been regarded a win for the EU, because services are worth 80% of British exports. Because they're not in the agreement, Brussels is in the driving seat. On the level playing field, an issue that, I'll be honest, was made a bigger issue than it needed to be, this is still considered a win for the UK, because we are no longer committed or forced to commit to dynamic alignment, or basically to mirror EU standards. But there is a clause, a non-regression clause, which means we cannot lower our standards to undercut each other on trade. Since our standards are significantly higher than the EU's anyway, it's not an issue. But it is considered a narrow win for the United Kingdom. Is anyone counting these so far? On dispute resolution, the UK outright wins. The UK should and will remain outside the scope on EU law. They wanted the EU a ratchet clause, which would have allowed the EU to impose unilateral tariffs if it was unhappy at our standards or state aid. Thankfully, that did not happen. So we won on that. We take back control of how we impose our law. There is no role, by the way, for the European Court of Justice, but as far as I was aware, I was led to believe anyway, that the European Court of Justice was outside the EU's purview, but of course, if I'm wrong, oops. Now we come to the one that really bugs me. Fishing. I like fishing. I like fishing IRL and I like fishing on Twitch. Or as we call it on Twitch, fishing. Yes. This is a win for the European Union. So the current fishing quota the EU get, they get to keep 75% of it. For now. That's not even a joke. We get £146 million worth of fish back a year. But this only happens after a transition period of 5.5 years, which allows for EU fishermen to seek out other fishing grounds. At the end of this period, the UK will be in charge of 2/3 of its catch. From 2026, there will be an annual renegotiation of the extent of European access. The EU used a rather clever tool to force Boris to blink. They would have imposed sanctions across any sector it wished if it did not get what it wanted on fishing. Boris wanted 80% of the EU quota back after 3 years. But somehow, I assume under some kind of opium, he was convinced to get it all the way down to 35%. That is the weirdest negotiation I have ever seen, where you gave up 45%, actually 65%. Those fish belong to our fishermen and the EU should have no access to them and no leverage to gain access to them. This is, by the way, if not obvious already, the second key issue that somehow manages to find its way deep under my skin. And yes, UK fishermen are not best impressed that they don't get unfettered access to all our fish. And I do want to point out, just because we've regained access to a certain percentage of our fish, we are not bound by EU laws on quotas. But they, while being bound to quotas, may not necessarily fish to that quota. Fleecing an environment is the reason we took issue in the first place. To move on from that, we have agriculture, where farmers now benefit from zero tariffs and zero quotas. This is a UK win. On aviation and trucking, the EU wins because the EU has not granted automatic recognition to British aerospace designs and products. And this is because until the EU gains confidence in the UK's capability for regulation, this can't happen. Sounds a bit snobbish, but okay. There I was thinking 2 feathers being flapped counted. On crime, security and extradition, simply put, the UK wins. Cooperation on investigation into terrorism and serious crimes, okay, cool. Britain don't, however, have access to real-time access to DNA, fingerprint and airline passenger information, but will receive them quickly. We lose access to Europol and Eurojust, but the UK will cooperate with them, along with close cooperation on extraditions, but with further safeguards beyond the European arrest warrant. Many Remainers said it would be impossible to reach a deal without submitting to the European Court of Justice. It's nice to prove you wrong. On travel and migration, holidaymakers can visit the continent for 90 days without a visa. There are no work permits for business travellers, who can also travel to the EU for 90 days in any 180-day period. EU pet passports no longer valid for UK residents, and of course the end to free movement of people with the EU, which will be replaced with a points-based immigration system akin to that of Australia, which is another UK win. On education and qualifications, we don't take part in exchange programs like the Erasmus University Exchange Program, replacing it with the Turing scheme instead. There is no automatic mutual recognition of professional qualifications, such as doctors, vets and engineers, which has been considered an EU win, because while we wanted a comprehensive coverage on the mutual recognition of professional qualifications, the EU said, no fam. On health and social security, the UK wins because we retain control of social security benefits to EU migrants, while ensuring holidaymakers can still have access to free healthcare. On Northern Ireland, it's considered a compromise because Northern Ireland have to follow single market rules to ensure the border with Ireland remains open. Customs procedures, they will be in place for goods crossing the Irish Sea because Northern Ireland will have access to EU Customs Union while remaining in the UK Customs Union. And there will be physical checks on some plant and animal products, but not at the border. Also, Ulster remains subject to many EU rules overseen by the Court of Justice, the European Court of Justice. And finally, break clause. This one I wasn't too sure about, but after 4 years the whole deal could be terminated if either the UK or the EU believes it is not working. The entire trade deal can also be reopened if the two sides cannot resolve a dispute. Now, of course, individual chapters can also be reopened to resolve disputes, but it depends on the issue, I guess. This is considered a UK win because British sovereignty is, air quotes, maintained. So who won? In retrospect, the UK kinda did win, and it should now pass through Parliament. There are a number of Tory members of Parliament who are Brexiteers who don't agree with this, and I fully agree with them. It's not a very good deal. But at the same time, both sides are saving face right now, saying that it's an amazing deal. I believe even when it was signed, Farage was championing it, but I don't believe at the time he had had access to it. I know Keir Starmer also supports this deal, and I know he also had members of his party at the back benches saying, no, this isn't a good deal, but they were mostly rejoiners and or remainers. So what happens now? Simply, it gets ratified in UK Parliament and the EU member states vote on it. If all goes through, then we leave. Finally, I will remain unfavourable of this deal, but will be glad to see the back of this so we can move on to more interesting and important issues. While I will agree this is an important issue, it has been going on since mid-2016 and we're almost at 2021.